Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream Vision by podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Bird. And today we're going to be talking about Paul. Was Paul the first Christian? And today's topic is going to be based on our book, Permission Granted. Take the Bible into your own hands. The link will be in the description below. And that being said, welcome back to the show, Dr. Bird.
Thank you, Jacob. It's nice to be back again. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Fun question, right? Fun question. I happen to agree with Pamela Eisenbaum when she says that Paul was not a Christian. Name of her book, right? Paul was not a Christian.
I've had her on too.
Yeah, I'm sure you have. I'm glad. I'm glad to know that. She's lovely. And I'm sure she brought a really interesting conversation for your listeners.
It certainly was.
Yeah. I remember standing in the reception for Fortress Press, which is very Paul-friendly kind of group of people since it's Lutheran. And I was commenting on her book that had just been released that year. And these two guys, I won't name names, but they were like, "What do you mean he was a Christian?" Like, well, interesting. So anyway, over to you. What's up? How do you want to get into this conversation today, Jacob?
Well, the question, the reason I asked that question is that there are some that will ask, did the term Christian really exist in Paul's time? Paul in his letters, or at least the ones that are regarded to be the authentic letters of Paul, never uses the term Christian, and not even the other ones that are doubted. And I know it depends on which scholars one asks, did Paul write those other letters or not, but that's beside the point. Not even those contain the word Christianos. And so what did Paul understand him to be? What did he classify himself to be in his time? And did the term Christian exist in his time and he just failed to use it? Or did it come into existence after he died?
Right. So I have to be honest that the best I can tell you is I have trusted sources who've told me that the first time we see it in texts at all is in the year 67. And I'm not going to apologize for not being the one to go look those up. But so the term Christian or Christianoid, Christianos, however, whichever form of it, doesn't come into use until the late 60s. And if you trust the general historical idea that Paul was in Rome and was most likely martyred, he was actually executed perhaps by the Romans in Rome in the mid-60s, then it makes it difficult for him to have even been familiar with the term for sure. And I tend to lean in that direction, that that it wasn't a term that he would have known of, certainly isn't one he would have used, because our understanding of its first use is as a slur, and it's a slur being used by one group of people to differentiate themselves from this other group of people who identify under the same general umbrella. And so it's, Jews over here using a negative nickname to refer to this group of people over here who are considering themselves part of the covenant, but they're primarily Gentiles and they're not circumcising themselves or their children, their boys at day 8, and they're not doing the things that male Jews in particular would be doing. So why are they getting to call themselves Jews? And so this nickname or this slur is a way to differentiate those over there, that group claiming to identify with the covenant, those Christian ones, those Christ-like ones, the ones that are bringing the word Christ into their congregation, into the language that they're using. So I don't think that Paul would have been using it in a positive way yet, for sure, the way that people do now. So that did take a while for that kind of a negative idea to be claimed. And we see that happen with all kinds of labels over the centuries. So the label itself, no, I don't think Paul, the other thing about this, the origin of this term, again, I'm trusting other scholars who have looked into this, so I can't point you to the text where it says it, but that it was a designation for people in Paul's home congregation or church, like the people that met in Syrian Antioch, right? So I've actually been to that cave on the side of the mountain that is allegedly his home base, if that really was a thing. 2009 or 10, not in the last decade. Yeah, so it was a reference being used specifically for Paul's home base. It was used against him or the people that he knew, the people in his home community, if you will. So, I don't. That's about all I can say in terms of where the term itself came from, and why we should reconsider using it in a positive way, at least in the first century. That people will claim a negative, will claim a slur being directed at them and try to take the power out of it by saying, "Oh yeah, well then we're just going to use it, and in a different way than you meant it." That's a thing that people do. So, what does that term mean? I think is the question to ask, right? What do people mean? What did they mean initially by it? What do people, over the centuries mean by it? And that, I think, is an interesting question. And certainly varies, right? You can look at any of the scholars who were doing a form of, historical Jesus work, or have done any work talking about the early churches and the early groups of people within what is called the church. So, I'm trying to think about who your audience is, by the way, Jacob. I'm like, this isn't, who's listening to this? Do I need to clarify some of these things? The term ecclesia that Paul uses to refer to the communities, that's a political label. It's a social movement, political movement kind of a thing. And so Paul's using that to refer to this group of people that are meeting in homes, and they're predominantly made up of Gentiles who are now claiming to get to be a part of the covenant. It's a really, it's kind of a wild ride. So, it's from the very get-go. There have always been multiple identities, a range of identities or definitions of what that term refers to. Who, if a group is going to claim it, what does that mean to them? And as we know, people define what it means to be a follower of this guy, Jesus the Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth, or whatever you want to end up calling him. People define that very differently from the very beginning, right? There isn't a point in time where everybody is thinking or believing the same thing. So it's kind of a fun question, I think. What do people mean by it in the first century, in the second century, much less today,
So do you think that Paul still saw himself as Jewish, and perhaps that's why in the letter to the Philippians he seems to get upset at people that are questioning him, because he stresses that he's a Hebrew of Hebrews and he's a Benjamite. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I do strongly recommend Pamela Eisenbaum's book for that reason. She goes into quite a bit of detail to explain why she does not think that Paul ever thought of himself as a Christian, or would have claimed that label even if it had been in use in his lifetime. And the main thing I will say about that is, from a first century Jewish perspective, probably even still to this day, but certainly in first century Common Era, you wouldn't expect to give up that identity, even if you started to agree with some other thoughts and ideas. So it's a part of who he was. It's how he was born. It's what he was born into. It's his people, his family, his history, his tradition, his scriptures. And so to say that he would become a Christian in that context just doesn't really make any sense yet. And he's a Jew. He always was a Jew. And the language, there are two different places where people raise a question. I like that you referenced the one in Philippians where he's basically just like, he's kind of shouting out his parts of his resume, like, take me seriously. But even in Galatians, the earlier passage where he talks about his former life in Judaism, some people say that is a nod to him saying he no longer identifies with Judaism. And I agree here with Eisenbaum when she says, no, that's simply a way of saying formerly, like, 10 years ago or whatever, formerly in my life in Judaism, this is what I was doing. And now this is who I am and this is what I'm doing. And that element of his identity isn't ripped asunder just because he's taking a message to Gentiles now, right? I can't remember. Did I address all your questions on that one?
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
And what do you make of the lack of the miracle stories of Jesus? Jesus walking on water, Jesus healing the blind, and healing the sick, and healing the disabled. All that stuff is missing from Paul's letters. All we see in Paul's letters is the resurrected Jesus. That's all he tells us about, that Jesus rose from the dead.
Yeah.
And he gives us a brief mention of the Eucharist and a vague mention of his betrayal. And that's really it. And then in the Gospels, which are written later than Paul's letters, they give us all these stories about Jesus. So my question is, do you think that some of these miracle stories were circulating perhaps orally around Paul's time and Paul just failed to talk about it for some reason? Or do you think those stories hadn't been created yet?
Oh, it's such a fun question, Jacob. The thing is, I feel like I need to make sure I'm addressing a wide range of people here with this answer. So if I'm saying something that you or your listeners already know, please don't be offended. I just want to make sure people understand what I'm thinking about and where I'm coming from.
Sure.
When I look at early Christianity and the development of the early church and sit with it and learn from other scholars who are trying to make sense of the birth of Christianity or the beginnings of Christianity, all of those things. I read it pretty significantly through the lens of Paul creating something and finding a way in his own scriptures to justify it or to back it up. And I do honestly think that the whole setup of how this thing developed ought to be under more scrutiny from a psychological perspective. I'm kind of outing myself today. I don't. So let me just stick to your question. See if I can stick to your question without just sounding absolutely insane. Because I look at what Paul did. I look at what he's done, what he did, and the ideas he pulled together. And I really think he didn't think some of it through. He didn't think through the logical conclusions of some of what he was doing, because he really threw Judaism and traditional Jews like under the bus with what he did. I don't think he thought it through. And so it worked for Gentiles, but he didn't think about the fallout for everybody else who was already in the covenant, So I think about I read Paul, I read the early church or the early movement of Christianity through this lens of Paul creating something. And therefore, right, then you have to have stories to justify it that come along shortly, not long after he gets this idea out there. He's perpetuating it away from where most of the Jews at the time, not all, of course, because there's always, there's diaspora, but, he's not in Palestine. He's not in Judea. He's not in that part of the world. He's over here in modern day Turkey and Greece, So it takes a while for the need for a narrative that backs up what Paul is saying to even occur to people or whatever. And some people suggest the first Gospels were being written because those early generation of folks were dying off and things like that. I think there are all kinds of explanations and that are all playing into it. But yeah, which of the miracles did a guy from Nazareth actually perform? None, like what? um which ones make sense of his story? Which ones bolster the message that they're trying to say? That's the question I think we bring respectfully to these narratives that we find in the Gospels. What is it that each Gospel writer is trying to portray, trying to communicate to their listener, their audience? That's, and that tells us what kinds of stories are then attributed to him. And it's not like they're original with him. These are the kinds of things that people are talking about. He's not the first to do these things. And I'm sure, Jacob, you're well familiar with some of these other stories, but if your listeners are not, it was news to me when I was in seminary and I heard that, it might not have even been till PhD work, when I actually heard that, oh, wait, there were other people making that had the same things attributed to them. Like, wait, what? I thought everything about Jesus was new to him and unique and, all that great stuff. A lot of people are in that boat. And, so yeah, I've just to this is related but kind of tangential to what you're asking me to discuss, but I'm reading a book called The Testament of Mary by Colm Tóibín. He's an Irish writer. I think he does more than just fiction. I think he has done some nonfiction, but I'm reading his version of, just a version of Mary, Jesus' mother Mary, her story, and later on in life, and she's living in Ephesus and all this great stuff. But the way he talks about how certain miraculous events are attributed to her son, it humanizes everything, and it's a very plausible rendering of how these miraculous things end up being attributed to anyone, right? Much less this one particular guy, right? So, I don't have I don't have a preference in terms of stating whether or not Jesus existed, because I don't know which Jesus we're talking about. Like, there's a guy that we've pinned a whole bunch of stuff on that I think we can all agree on. Is there a kernel in there of who he was, of a guy that we can point to? Probably. I have no idea what he actually accomplished, but I know that it makes a lot of sense to say a whole bunch of things about him in light of his Jewish history. And, so you get these gospel narratives that are connecting him to his Jewishness and also trying to make sense of what Paul has done. And, it's really terribly sad to me that what Paul did was he chose to create a thanophilic religion, right? He chose to create a religion that requires death. And, that in and of itself, to me, means he needs therapy. You know what I mean? Like, you are positing that the whole framework here around pleasing the God is based on something dying. Like, that's a kid, like, that you want to make sure doesn't get near like kittens and puppies. Do you know what I'm saying, Jacob? Like,
Yeah.
that's unsettling to me. And that is what he chose to create. And so, of course, the only thing that matters in this religious framework setup is that someone died, because that's the example that he's choosing to work with, is the element of being, in this case, executed by the state, I would say. But so he's using that as a ticket for Gentiles. So you got to figure that out, and you got to spin your own scriptures to figure out how to make sense of that. And you got to pull this from that and this and lots of cherry picking. And yeah. So I'm answering questions you didn't really ask, but I think they were kind of related to what you were asking about. I think that the stories about miracles are just, those are the kinds of stories that people told about people, about important people, to give them gravitas, And so, yeah, who Jesus actually was, what he actually stood for, didn't matter to Paul. It didn't matter. And, this bizarre irony in that, right? That the thing that would have gotten a Jewish man killed, executed by the state, is actually caring about justice, caring about the economically and politically oppressed. That's what gets you, if you're leading a group that's angry about that, that gets you squelched, right? And then Paul creates this other thing that doesn't even have anything to do with social justice, and it's very spiritual. And so no wonder the whole empire can take it up, and just redirects away from the social and economic oppression that was behind the reason to execute a Jewish man in the first century, right? Yeah.
So we do have a question from the audience.
Okay.
And if it seems off topic to you, if any of these questions seem off topic to you, just feel free to tell me. JC, thank you for your question. Question about Paul. Marcus Vincent's Marcionite Paul collection is 30% of the canon. Publication forthcoming. Should be fascinating comparison.
Well, yeah, I don't see it. I'm sorry. I'm feeling a little bit snarky. Let me not be snarky. I don't actually see a question here. I think that you're pointing something out that is, worth pointing out, and noting that Marcion, one of the early church fathers, who people were happy to talk about until they didn't want to anymore, that kind of issue. Yeah, but he didn't want to include references to the Hebrew Bible if he could help it, right? So he didn't use Matthew because that's full of Hebrew Bible references. Marcion was condemned, was considered a heretic because he did take to a certain extent to heart, and I don't fully agree with him, but I do to a certain extent. He saw the general character of the God of the Hebrew Bible as angry and vengeful and all this stuff, and thought that the God of the Newer Testament was love, and I disagree with that. There are moments, but it seems to be there's more moments of wrath and judgment and language, rhetoric that leads to harmfulness. So I just don't agree with the God of love bit overall in the New Testament. But yeah, this guy was important. Marcion was important. He had influence. He gave people some ideas. There are a lot of people in churches today, actually, who are still quite Marcion. They just don't know the language or know what that means, which is, not a big fan of the Old Testament because there's no Jesus in there, and we're just going to focus on these other things in the Newer Testament that work for me. And I don't actually call it the Old Testament, by the way, but people in churches tend to. So I think maybe I have a question back for JC, which is, I think there is a point you're trying to make. What is it? Because what's the comparison? I don't know what you mean. Do you mean interesting to compare Marcion's collection to the fuller collection that is canonized? Is that what you mean? It'd be interesting to look at. What do we lose? I don't know. Is someone saying I'm cray cray? That's awesome. Thank you. I will own that. That's fine with me. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that, Jacob?
I think he's trying to ask you about when one looks at the Apostolokon, that's the collection that's being talked about here. Because what some scholars that look at Marcion would do is they'll look at that and say that the Apostolokon, in their view, is an earlier collection of Paul that predates canonical Paul. And therefore, they think that canonical Paul is the result, was the result of lots of redactional activity with the letters on the letters of Paul. And if that's the case, then Paul wrote a lot less, even in the authentic letters, than people tend to believe. So that's I think that's what is being asked about here. What your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, I can't speak to that. I'm so sorry. I don't tend to do a whole lot of historical scholarship these days, just FYI. I'm more interested in what people are doing with the texts today, and how being devoted to memorizing, using the Christian Bible, so the Hebrew Bible and the Newer Testament, what it does to people who very much take these scriptures to heart, consider them the word of God, have been taught not to question it, all those kinds of things. That's more my wheelhouse, is talking about, now that everything that we do have in the canon is in there, and we've had several multiple centuries of people interpreting it for us and telling us how we should read it. What are people doing with it today? That's more my wheelhouse, and I'm very interested in talking about that and in helping people to see a new way of engaging this collection called the Bible for Christians, or however you want to refer to the collection. So I'm not going to be able to contribute a whole lot on these conversations, like someone like Bart Ehrman could. That's not my wheel. It's never been my interest. That's not true. I had an interest in it for about a year or two. And then I became much more interested in the way these texts were actually impacting people and harming people to a great degree. I just saw a comment about, I can't help but wonder if Dr. Bird wants to speak on Genesis 38, given the bookshelf. Yeah, I have a book out called Marriage in the Bible. What do the texts say? And I'm very interested in talking about all the different things that go along with that. And I happened to stumble upon Ejaculate Responsibly recently, and a whole new way to think about abortion. For those who think that we should stop preventing access to abortion, how about we think about abortion differently? It's a fantastic book, by the way. And she's not angry. She's not in anyone's face. She's just talking about a whole bunch of things about it that perhaps ought to be part of the conversation. So yes, I actually do. I'm hoping to have a conversation with her, actually. I don't know if I'll be able to line that up, but I'm working on that. Who is moderating this chat? I'm sorry. I am feeling very, it's been a productive day. All right. I'm just responding to the comments. So you can just reel me in all you need to, Jacob. Just.
Well, I'll get back to my questions in a moment, but I'm going to take this one.
Okay.
Lucas Hunt says, say we label those who follow Christ as Christians, even if they would not recognize the label. Do pre-Pauline hymns suggest these Christians predate Paul?
So we label those who follow Christ as Christians, even if they would not recognize the label. Okay, we're calling them a thing as a category just for the sake of having a label, I guess. Do pre-Pauline hymns? Okay, I think I see what your question is. Were there people following Jesus prior to Paul in the way that Paul suggests? Lucas, is that what you're asking? Were there, because here's the thing, from a very slim collection of data, right? We have very little to work off of here. Let's posit, how about this? Let's posit that there's a guy named Jesus that we can pin all this to, right? Like there was a guy from Nazareth named Jesus who was kind of interested in social justice. Like we can say that. So if that guy is executed by the state, does he have followers who continue on in his name? I do think so, right? I do think that is the case. The thing is, they weren't doing what Paul suggests we do with Jesus's death, right? If Jesus had followers who tried to continue on with his message, they are still upset about overtaxation by their own leaders. They're still upset about the way land is being taken from people in the north and in Galilee. They're upset about economic and political injustices. They're not trying to get you into heaven by accepting Jesus as your savior, as a substitutionary atonement for your sin. That's just not what's going on for them. So if there are people who are claiming to be Christ ones, followers of this guy, the Christ, they're still, I do think, and I'm happy to hear suggestions otherwise, right? And data or evidence that would help me to think differently. I think they're just still Jews who are angry about the same things he was. And so they're still trying to do what they can, even though they've gotten a pretty strong message from Rome saying they need to disband, right? So I don't think it's realistic. Again, open to information, but I don't think it's realistic to say that there was a group of people who would be Christians in the way that Paul establishes. That doesn't make any sense to me, right? Paul comes up with it, and I think in a very interesting way or suggestion about the whole thing. Like, I think he kind of has an aha moment and tries and has some time to work it out, and that is not what Jesus' own disciples are even on about. So if in your scenario, Lucas, what we have is people who are following Christ or trying to continue his work, they aren't the same group of people that Paul is talking about. They aren't Jews who are on to this other thing. They aren't Gentiles who've come into the covenant or think that they've come into the covenant through the death of Christ, and that the focus is on his death covering their sins. Two different things. I do think that Paul created what became Christianity. And so I don't think it's reasonable to talk about a group of people identifying with this label and doing anything akin to what Paul's talking about. It just doesn't make sense to me. And it's very easy to not tease that out, to not try to sort that out in our own minds, because it's too far removed. And there's been a lot done and said, and a lot of people within Christian circles are deeply influenced by the narratives of the book of Acts, which is understandable and also deeply tragic, in my very biased opinion.
So, what kind of politics do you think that Paul adhered to?
I don't mean to be, I'm not trying to be evasive here. What do you mean? What kind of politics?
What do you think he thought of the political atmosphere in his time as he was trying to preach his message, trying to convert people and from their like, how did he consider their ideology and what kind of
Yeah.
people that they were? Did he factor any of that in when he was trying to convert anyone?
Yeah. I'm well, it's just an interesting question, Jacob. That's why I'm mulling it over, and I have so many different thoughts in response to that. One, I do think he was a bit of a chameleon, and when he says in one of the Corinthian letters, I'm all things to all people. Yeah, he was a good politician, right? I do think that's true of him, and I think that is also that plays into some of the confusion in terms of understanding where he is actually coming from. You can't always tell, I think, although ultimately we kind of know. But so when you're trying, I mean, I can say that. Like, there are times when I identify with a community. I use us language, or I use language to indicate that I understand where they're coming from, or I understand what they're thinking. And it's kind of a shorthand. It's so that they hear that I understand. But I might not agree with what they think and believe, but I understand it, and I'm trying to respect it, and I acknowledge what they think in order to increase the chances that they will hear what it is I'm trying to say. So when you ask about what are Paul's politics, I mean, I do think the guy was pretty clever, intelligent. What did he think about the Roman Empire in the first century? Should we do some sort of spoof of Paul thinking of the Roman Empire every day, every hour of every day? You know, do our own little video about how often do you think about the Roman Empire? Yeah, I mean, you can't. I don't think you could be an aware person in the first century and not think about it. I mean, do people today not think about the American government's influence in our lives? Sure, right? So not everybody does, but there are plenty of people who just think about it all the time, right? So in that way, I think he would have been aware of it. To what did he think of it? I don't know, and I have not spent any time trying to figure that out. I think there's some really fascinating things, implications of Paul's letters. Excuse me. In terms of a message that is then friendly to the Roman Empire. You know, his message makes a really strong move toward bringing a large collective, a large, massive, large numbers of the masses, because it's not like everyone got on board, but large numbers of the masses under this one particular ideology, which makes them easier to control, and that's very friendly to Roman imperial goals and purposes. I don't think I have any of the books on the shelves behind me. I think my Paul books are over on a different bookshelf, but I've read some of my colleagues' work on Paul and imperial language, and what is he doing in his letters? Is he co-opting political language? Is he complicit because he he puts within the framework of Christian churches a hierarchy and a framework that is friendly to empire, right? Is he complicit with empire because he's creating a different empire within the church that I think there's all kinds of ways to read his letters, and so I don't have a definitive response to your question. I think it's a really interesting question. Paul and politics. I mean, there are plenty of books and articles that have been written about this issue, and very, critical thinking, scholarship and ideas. I think I'm more interested in, how does it function then for people today, right? And I see the language of empire, or the language of kingdom, as a problematic metaphor, and as something that is not very healthy for people. And so, Lord, all of it, right? King, all the parts of the metaphor as they play out in community, rhetoric, and So, I'm more interested in what was canonized. How does that affect people? Because I'm not sure that we can. I mean, when I think about people today in similar locations or in similar situations, how kind of slippery they might be with, even if they have good intentions, or how much they might be working a particular power dynamic for a different good, or for what they perceive to be an end that was worth this, compromise in the middle, or whatever. I just think that humans are really, really quite complicated. And when it comes to people in positions of any kind of position of power, in a context that is highly patriarchal, like, I just think, it's a bit of a crapshoot what people actually think and believe versus what they're saying and doing and putting into writing. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. JC, thank you for your super chat. Agree that Phenophilic Pauline theology is an awful idea. What does Dr. Bird think of Jesus' death as replacing temple sacrifice after its destruction?
What do I think Jesus's death as replacing temple sacrifice after its destruction. Well, it's a great question, first of all. I think it raises important issues in this context and of what's ideas, ideologies, belief systems, things that people are to this day still upholding or trying to live into. So this is a really interesting question on that level. So I have a couple different things. Let me see if I can do this briefly or succinctly. When I teach Intro to the Hebrew Bible, which I do, even though I don't have a PhD in Hebrew Bible, but once you get in, religious studies, you can teach a lot of different things. So I teach Introduction to the Hebrew Bible 4 times a year. And one of the things that I will highlight for my students and am desperate to get them to consider, which for people who come from a Christian background, it's really a push for them to consider it, as you probably know, JC. But I ask them to think really seriously about animal sacrifices, about how they're talked about in Leviticus in particular, just as one to focus on, that's where the laws about them are. But, what's being said about them? Let's be honest about the scene. There's a lot of blood splattered all over the place. What does that smell like? Let's talk about this. Let's be honest about entrails and bodily parts and this and that. And in general, many people, including myself, even though I try to be vegetarian, like the scent of a barbecue, right? And that's so God, it's a pleasing aroma to God, right? That's what pleases him. Okay, so God is hangry and we need to appease him by sacrificing an animal. Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's what we're talking about. So the concept of taking a life and offering it up in the smoke makes God happy. That premise in and of itself needs to go. I mean, it just needs to go, but it hasn't, because it's taken up on this atonement thing going on with Jesus on a cross, which he's being executed because the people in power can't handle the justice that his resistance stands for, right? So that's a whole different thing. So to say that Jesus's execution replaces animal sacrifice, that is certainly what most Christians that I know would say, and hold on to that dearly and say, God gave his son, and of all the things that he could have given, he gave his own son. And, this is actually, child abuse, really, if you want to take that to cosmic child abuse. But that's how much God loves us. Well, guess what, folks? I have yet to have a parent in a classroom who would allow this. I just have not. I've had hundreds of parents in my classrooms, and not a single one is okay with the idea of sacrificing their child in this kind of way. So the framework, the premise, all of these basic ideas are really powerful and I think devastatingly harmful. They are harmful in so many different ways that play out over the centuries, and we can see the ideas behind this concept of substitutionary atonement. Jesus's execution replaces that animal sacrifice. That means we still think that God needs to be appeased. That means we're still saying that who we are as humans makes God angry to the point he needs to be appeased at us. There are so many pieces to this theology that I think need to go. So, what do I think about that idea? I think that is what most Christians believe. I think they're taught to believe that. And it's another layer of keeping people from seeing what I think this guy Jesus would have been executed over, which is caring about social justice, economic justice, and exploitation. And let's fix this world, right? And there are many things about the premise that God can't look at us because of our sin until there's a death that covers over it all with blood and all these different, there are so many different pieces to this language, to this theology that just, I used to agree with, I used to preach to people, I used to teach and hope people would get on board with, and it just turns my stomach. I find it so unhelpful and harmful, and it keeps us focused on the wrong things. It keeps us focused on judging others. It keeps us focused on sin and shamefulness instead of just being aware that humans aren't perfect, right? It keeps us focused on this thing about our sinfulness needs to be addressed. And it's our sinfulness and us to heaven. And it's just such a bizarre, it's not bizarre. I'm sorry, it's not bizarre. It's a very common belief. And that's why it's important to suggest an alternative way of thinking about it.
And in my closing question, what do you think Paul's ultimate goal was when he was like, yes, he converted to the faith and he believes in Jesus. He wants to spread the message to the Gentiles. He calls himself an apostle of to the Gentiles.
To the Gentiles, yes.
But what was he hoping for society? What do you think his ultimate goal was in the end?
This is the time where I need to acknowledge the whole apocalyptic piece. And I don't know to what extent, by the time he dies, that he's still hung up on an apocalyptic vision. But it certainly is there. Excuse me. It certainly is there. In some of Paul's early writings. And, plenty of scholars will say, right, this is key to understanding what Paul is saying, right? If he believes that the Son of Man is returning soon, then it just changes where your priorities are. It changes the kinds of responses you give to any kind of question, right? If you don't think that this version of existence is going to be around much longer, but God is going to visit in human form again and wipe out all your enemies and establish a just kingdom on earth, right? That does change the way you think about things, and so the way you'd respond to questions when they come up. So I'm wondering also about some of the parts of your question, Jacob, because, what was his vision for the world? I don't know. Did he know even? Did he think that bringing the nations to the table, as his efforts were trying to do, did he think that was going to bring about the return of the Son of Man, in kind of an ancient Zionistic kind of idea, right? That we do this and that brings about the end of the persecution and the struggle and the suffering of the people that he's a part of, right? Is that what he was thinking of? Potentially. Did he have equality between the sexes in mind? No, I don't think he did. I think he had some moments where he speaks about it, and it would have been beautiful if that had been able to stick around, but it doesn't. It doesn't work because patriarchy is too strong. And so did he have a utopian idea of undermining or the eradication of the economic classes? I mean, the fact that there were people who had enough means to have other humans enslaved to them and working for them, different forms of enslavement. Did he have a vision to undermine that and do away with it? No, I really don't think that was on his mind. I really don't. He does not speak to that. He speaks about a space where those realities don't count, but he doesn't talk about eradicating enslavement. In fact, I think he actually quite benefits from it. So that would not, I don't think he'd be likely to want to see it for the awful thing that it was in the first century, or to talk about it. I think he benefited too much from it. So what did he want? What was he trying to go for? I think he might have had a fairly radical view of what it would mean to make sure some of these biblical references or biblical ideas came about, or helped with the fruition of them, because that would lead to X, Y, and Z. But I'm pretty hesitant to go on record actually saying what I think. You know what I mean? Like that's more than I think any of us can really say, right? What do you think he thought? I'm just curious. Like you have the question. Do you have any thoughts about it?
To me, it seems to me that he's trying to preach a message in which he's trying to tell other people that they've misinterpreted the teachings of the historical Jesus. Because it seems like he bases his authority, at least in my view, off of his vision. He has this vision that he doesn't really tell us a lot about. He's supposedly taken up to this third heaven, and he sees this bright light. He doesn't tell us that Jesus and God said anything to him when he's having this vision. But when he's taken back down from the vision, he converts. That's supposedly how it goes, according to Paul in 2 Corinthians. And he seems to be arguing that that's how he obtains his knowledge. It's like he says in Galatians that he didn't receive from no man.
Right.
He got it from revelation.
He got it straight from God. Yeah.
Which seems to harken back to 2 Corinthians.
Sorry. Yeah. I think that 2 Corinthians is an elaboration on what he said earlier, and perhaps may be true as well, but I think it's to increase the possibility for people to take him seriously that he makes that elaboration. But I agree with you. There's no specifics given about what was said, and the light isn't there initially. He just has this aha moment, right? God revealed his son in me, is what the Greek says. Most people translate it as to me, but in me. So there's some sort of internal aha moment, I'd say, an epiphany. Yeah, I mean, he doesn't. I just want to be careful, I think, or cautious around talking about Paul converting people in general. I think that's a loaded term, and that I do think it might have meant something different in his context than it does to us. But I also I don't think he changed his identity. But I hear your comment about after he has somebody was raised to the third heaven, right? I don't know who, but somebody. And then things are different when they're back. Well, yeah, but I think things are different when he gets out of that, whatever it was, because he's got a different mission. Prior to that, Paul was out to kill Jesus's disciples. When he has a vision, he changes tracks entirely and does something else entirely. Like, he's not agreeing with what Jesus was up to. He had been threatened by what Jesus was up to. And so he has an epiphany that allows him to do something with Jesus's death that doesn't hold him to actually approving of what Jesus was up to. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
And I want to be really clear that what Paul is up to is not the same thing as what Jesus was up to. And that he wasn't, as a Jew, he didn't need, according to his own definition of how Gentiles got into the fold, into the covenant, he didn't need it, right? He was already in. So I don't think that it makes sense for him to talk about becoming a Christian. Does he use language that identifies with that, the community that he's trying to create? Does he talk about it that way? That's something a little different, actually. So anyway, we all have our own strong opinions, don't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Jennifer Bird.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me back on.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.